lot on the agenda today, but a lot of it is, fortunately, introduction of new topics and informational. So hopefully we can finish a little earlier than planned. I'm sorry that we're running a little bit late. We had another meeting in this room that ran a little bit over. So I'll start with a roll call. Councilor Tabor?
Present.
Councilor Lombardi?
Here.
And I'm Councilor Cook, and I am present. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes from February 14th and February 28th?
Yes, so approved.
And second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. Minutes are approved. So we're going to start out our discussions with the City Council Rules of Procedure. You received a copy via email of changes. I'm hoping that we can share those on the screen with anyone who's joining us, so that everyone can see it who's joining us via Zoom, and anyone in the room can also see these changes. So we've been discussing these rules.
Just a second, it's not.
It's not quite sharing yet. I'll do it preface. We've been discussing the rules for several weeks now, and we haven't come to full agreement on all of them, but on several of them we have. I would like to go through the recommended rules changes that we discussed last week and reach general consensus on, and hopefully we can move forward with these rules changes, the ones where we're all in agreement, to the City Council with a recommendation for approval at the next City Council meeting. Are we fully sharing now?
We are.
Okay. So the first rule that we discussed was Rule 3 on work sessions. And we removed text, as you will all see, that talked about polling of the council, because that was inconsistent with policy as far as not having votes in work session. That was recommended by the city attorney. Is there any comment on that one?
We're good on that.
Rule 13, disposition of motions. We added clarifying language, and you'll see that in paragraph B on friendly amendments. This language had not been in our rules prior. We had been practicing friendly amendments, but we hadn't codified what they were or what the practice should be. And this also allows for objection by any city councilor in a meeting if they didn't agree that it was a friendly amendment, and ask for a vote. Any
Right.
comment?
I think it's good.
Okay.
Yep.
Motions during debate. Again, this is a really minor edit to clarify what a privilege is. It's really a personal privilege. For example, having to get up to use the restroom during a meeting. So, any concerns there?
Not at all.
Conflicts of interest. We added this clarifying language so that people would refer to other sections of not just rules, but to our city charter and our ethics ordinance. It's just a note that's added, a reference note. Any comments or concerns here?
Looks good.
Okay. Rule 34, our city clerk. We changed the word executive to non-public. I think there'd been some confusion there. Executive is the old language that we used to use for non-public sessions. So wanted to call them non-public since that's what we call them in city council meetings. Any?
I do have a comment on this. Let's see, in about the 5th line down of where states the city clerk shall note in the minutes all reports, memorials, and other papers submitted to the council by their title or brief description of the purport
Yeah,
and
typo.
purpose. Purport kind of connotates a negative, false.
Well, I would ask, what does it mean? Does it mean report? Does it mean purpose?
I would suggest that it should say purpose, because purport connotates a false statement.
Could I ask the deputy city attorney for a view on that?
I would frankly just put the period after the word description, brief description. Wouldn't that kind of do it?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Does everyone seem to think that's reasonable? To
Yes.
strike those last three words?
Yeah.
So we are striking the words "of the purport," 5 lines down. Brief, and the sentence would end with "counsel by their title or brief description," period.
Yeah. If you want an and, title and brief description, that might kind of get you more detail. It depends if you want that.
Yes, I think that's good.
I think, yeah, the more the better for the record.
Okay. And.
And? Any other concerns there with Rule 34?
No.
Okay. Rule 41, address by the public. And again, this was one of the issues was referred to us by the city council. We had discussed leaving it as is, even though it's not standard practice. Standard practice is currently to suspend the rules, so it requires 2/3. But this would allow more flexibility, not less, if you had 5 council members, for example, that wanted to hear from somebody. So, anyone have any questions around Rule 41?
No,
No.
I like that added flexibility.
Okay. Rule 43, public comment session. There was general consensus to leave public comment as is, so that we maintain public comment at all city council meetings. The language is just amended in public dialogue, section B. So if you go to section B, and this language is designed to allow more flexibility for public dialogue, but also to remove this. It doesn't become an alternative to public comment in this case. It becomes an additional opportunity for residents to speak with the council, and in more settings, so that we have more flexibility to meet outside of council chambers, outside of City Hall, but that we would not have more than 3 council members at a time, therefore not creating a quorum. So this is, I think, the most significant language change we have. And this would also presume scheduling of public dialogue sessions. So,
Right.
are there questions?
Yeah, there's just a slight confusion. The first time I read through it, it first says that at such council public dialogue sessions, no more than 3 members of the council, the city manager, and any appropriate staff as determined by the city manager. And in that sentence, it implies the city manager determines the council. But below, that's clarified, but I wonder if that first sentence could be clarified a little bit. I did not try to wordcraft that.
Right, so it's that second sentence, which is the awkward one.
It's an awkward
Yeah.
sentence.
At such council, public.
We could put, I mean, it could just put no more than 3 members of the city council as appointed by the mayor, period. The city manager and any other appropriate staff as determined by the, I don't know, I didn't try to wordcraft that, but.
I think it's a long sentence.
It is, it needs to be broken up, I think.
Yeah, it's a long sentence. It does I think it does express that what we're talking about is their city council members, but also the city manager and any appropriate staff as determined by the city manager. I think that we want to make sure we have that flexibility, that we can have 3 members of the council and city staff, especially when, say, you have a public dialogue session before something like a parking discussion, or, because you're
Neighborhood sidewalks.
right, you're going to want somebody there who's an expert on that from the city staff.
Would you like some wordsmithing here?
Yes, please.
Okay, so how about, and we can always put it up on the screen if it becomes useful, at such council public dialogue sessions, comma, no more than 3 members of the council shall be present, along with the city manager and any appropriate staff as determined by the city manager, period. Interested individuals shall be welcome for an informal dialogue session.
Got it?
Does that work?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's write that out. I'm going to write
Yep,
that out again.
I did, yep.
Okay, so let's read it out one more time.
Yep. You can if you'd like to. At such council public dialogue sessions, comma, no more than 3 members of the council shall be present, along with the city manager and any appropriate staff as determined by the city manager, period. Interested individuals shall be welcome for an informal dialogue session.
Do we need a clarification there on the city manager? Saying the city manager or,
Her designee?
yeah, or the city manager's designee.
Yeah. You could even put "or designee" in parens right after.
That would be fine. I just
That'll
don't want to
make it
put the
easier.
city manager in a position that
Yep.
um,
So she can
that she has
hand
to
it
be
off.
at every single.
Guess to who?
So what we'll do is, Cynthia, we can do this. Right after the first reference to city manager, put open paren or designee, close paren.
You're in the on-deck circle, Suzanne.
Seems like a reasonable change.
Yeah, and I'm not even really sure that you need the interested individual shall be welcome, because the next sentence goes right into the purpose of this session is to provide an opportunity for members of the public to directly interact.
Yeah.
So if you want to make it shorter, I think that next sentence
Clean
talks
that up.
about that inclusiveness.
And I'm fine with removing that.
Okay.
Yes.
The purpose of the session is to provide an opportunity for members of the public to directly interact with members of the council, the city manager, and any appropriate staff as determined by the city
Okay,
manager from
so-
time to time.
What we decided is that sentence is now superfluous, because the,
This
Yep.
is, the change here was counselors shall report back on the public dialogue session at the next regularly scheduled city council meeting. The mayor shall determine which city council members participate in each public dialogue session on a rotational basis, with the requirement that all city councilors participate in at least one public dialogue session in a calendar year. Are there any questions about those last 2 sentences?
What if we don't have enough public dialogue sessions to get every counselor to participate?
Then we probably need to schedule more. I think that the goal here is to create more access,
Right.
and it pushes that. This rule would push the council to provide more public access.
We'd need 3 in the course of a year.
Yes. You
That's
would
not
need at
under-
least 3. The way it was originally set up, it required it quarterly. So I think it's not unreasonable for us to require at least 3 sessions. And if this were to pass now, I think that there's reasonable time left in the year to schedule at least 3 public dialogue sessions, if not more. We're early enough in the year.
Right. Well, and, our thought in the council discussion had been, these could be at the citywide neighborhood forums. And it's looking, I was just at that meeting with Larry last week, it's looking like we're scheduling 3. So,
Okay,
that aligns.
that's positive.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay.
But that's subject to change, of course.
And this would also envision an informal report back in the way that city councilors report back
Right.
on committee work. Rule 47, appointments to boards and commissions. This essentially removes the requirement that people who have served 10 years, that you'd have to advertise for people who served 10 years, and makes it standard practice instead to always advertise all vacancies to boards and commissions. Which is the practice I think that we're generally following anyway. So in essence, this rule we were already beyond this rule as far as practice.
No, I think it's important that we get all those openings be advertised so that we get the best we can get.
Yes, I think that's the goal. And
Yep.
those are all the rules that we had discussed prior, that we had general consensus around. I would love to have a motion to move this forward to City Council with the proposed changes that we made today at the next City Council meeting with a recommendation for approval.
So moved.
Second?
Okay, any discussion?
And that includes today's revisions.
That includes today's revisions. No? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay. The rules will go forward with recommended changes to the city council, the next city council meeting. The next item on our agenda was the discussion of next steps on the council agenda rule. We have been discussing for several meetings now, a potential modification in the council agenda, and I think we haven't developed consensus around that yet. At this stage, I think I would like to go back and see if we can find an expert on best practice to make a recommendation on the agenda. This may mean that we just leave the agenda as is, but this would put off further discussion of the council agenda rule until we can bring in an expert to discuss this with us. Does that make sense?
I think that's good, yeah. And since our last meeting, did we get input from the city manager about her desire for a place on the agenda for her items?
I mean, we definitely want a place on the agenda for her items.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. I think that at this stage, I want to make sure that we're encompassing all those voices and that we're not missing something, and that we have somebody who can give us kind of reasonable feedback on what the best practice would look like for a city to streamline, with the goal of providing more time for strategic discussion at the city council level, and to be able to handle issues that are really consent agenda items more easily. So with that said, there's no further discussion there, if everyone's happy with that process.
Yes.
Then let's go on to number 5, the ethics process. Hoping that we have a status update today on where we are and how we're proceeding there.
Let's see, well, Vince and I met with the city manager, as you know, prior to our last meeting, and we got this memorandum of our discussion. We've not moved any discussion further than that, but I can recap where we were. We had the idea of an ethics officer, somebody who would investigate an ethics claim when it came in. That was favored not only by somebody who had lodged an ethics complaint in the past, but by somebody who had been the defendant in that action. They both thought there was benefit to having an independent investigator who would give a report to the Ethics Committee, and that's what the Ethics Committee would deliberate on. We recommended that any member of a governing body who's the subject of an ethics investigation and a violation has been found, when that governing body decides the penalty, that individual should recuse themselves. We recommended that the current makeup, being 4 people, should be 5, with 1 appointment by the mayor. We recommended that the language about cause for an ethics complaint being breaching confidentiality of things learned in non-public be strengthened. The wording's a little vague there. We heard from former Councilor Kennedy that more time is needed to prepare for the defendant. She spoke of having only several days, and I think that's a fairness thing. And we discussed whether the ordinance should compel the council or the governing body, whether it's police commission, fire commission, school board, to take action or not. And Attorney Sullivan's advice was, you could put that language in, but it could be relatively quickly overturned by a governing body. And there's one more item that we discussed early on and did not discuss with Bob Sullivan, and that's that the Ethics Committee recommend a penalty with their finding. That could be an item for discussion today, or we could take that up later. So that's where we are for right now.
I don't think I can add anything to that. I think John covered that pretty well.
Okay.
I think those are some pretty substantive changes. The ethics investigator, ethics officer is, I think, an innovation that could make the process work more efficiently. So I think.
And it still includes the short stop of the city attorney and
Yes.
the mayor.
Yeah, that stays in place.
And would we envision this ethics officer getting involved before a complaint comes to the city attorney and mayor, or after? I know that was one of the nuances that we heard from former Councilor Kennedy last week or 2 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have a vision for that yet?
Well, I think when we talked about it, I mean, we would have a person basically on retainer who is well-versed in ethics. And I think it could go either way. There's something to be said for it to be handled internally for what might be termed frivolous complaints. But anything of a more substantive matter probably could go to the ombudsman or whatever we're calling it first.
Yeah, so in other words, does it rise to the threshold that it needs to be investigated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's obviously a subjective quality. Maybe a legal quality, I don't know. That's the problem with ethics ordinances, and in all the literature I've read, and I've read more than I ever expected to read in dealing with this, is that it's not cut and dry.
Right. And there's the question of is it the appearance of an ethical conflict or an actual conflict? And there can be an ethical conflict that has a dangerous enough appearance that it undermines public confidence. It's not clear.
No. I wonder if it wouldn't make sense to, because I listened to public comment, and former Counselor Huda had expressed a concern about cost related to hiring an outside ethics officer and ombudsman, and I think that is a concern depending upon how many filings you receive in a time frame, because that is an expense that we would then have to start budgeting for and planning for. How about like a compromise being it doesn't go to the ombudsman until after review by the city attorney or the mayor, unless either feels a need to consult the ombudsman
To
before
start
making
the
a recommendation.
investigation, yeah.
Yeah. So that way they have access, but don't necessarily have to go there.
Right.
Deputy City.
Yeah, I was curious. I haven't had time to look to see whether any other municipalities, either inside or outside the state of New Hampshire, have adopted something. It seems like someone must have somewhere. So I was curious if you wanted me, or maybe I can delegate this to someone else, to do a look around to
Yeah, I think
see
that'd be good.
if how other municipalities or agencies might be doing this in a way that hits that balance of not costing a lot of money, but having that outside third
Right.
person who's got the ethics training and can kind of be that fresh set of eyes and have that investigatory piece. I mean, over the years, we've retained special counsel to do things, investigations, obviously, over time, and it does get a little pricey, but it's entirely appropriate in the right instance. I'm also wondering if any of them get, heaven forbid, volunteers, someone designated within the community as part of their bar association or something, who agrees to serve at, maybe some very discounted rate. So
We had
if
that
you'd like,
discussion, yeah. We had that discussion that there are lots of people with the capacity and public spirit to want to do it. Maybe there's a stipend for them, same way as counselors get our lofty $75 a meeting. But, and I think it'd be good to get either you or Bob's input on this, because, Bob has certainly been through more of these than we have.
yeah. If you like them for the next meeting, why don't we caucus in the legal department, and we'll also do some searching and see what other municipalities or agencies might be doing that might give us some additional
Yep.
feedback and thoughts on this issue of a independent kind of ombudsman ethics officer. Okay.
I know one thing that I would really like to see, if possible, is if we could start looking at the current ordinance language and looking at a draft of what this would look like changed, so that we can start working from text. I think sometimes that's easier for people to envision when we, for the public especially, when we're sharing text, they can see the changes and see where we are. Is that something that we think is reasonable for the next meeting, to start kind of working on some of these recommendations from that perspective?
Yeah, I think so. I
Yeah,
don't see why
I mean,
not.
we would turn to the city attorney to do this. It depends on his,
We can give it a shot and see if we can get something for you for the next meeting.
Well, we have a good summary of the discussion
Right.
that,
I think we've got an idea of at least where there's some common, interest in some of those changes we've talked about. And if we have some thoughts on some ombudsman-type language that could be woven in there while we continue to get some more information about who's doing what and whether there's a good model that we can borrow from some other municipality or agency. Yeah.
I think it would just be really helpful to have public comment on actual proposed language, because right now we're dealing with kind of
Little
these
squishy.
esoteric ideas, which I think we're in agreement that we need to move forward with a lot of these recommendations, but what do they look like on paper and in practice? So I think that would be really helpful for everybody,
Okay.
if we can.
I'll bring that back to the legal department, and we'll take these notes and see if we can get you a draft for the next meeting.
thank you.
Yes.
thank you.
Is there anything else we want to talk about around this today, or we want to go ahead and move forward?
I'm happy with that.
Yeah, I'm happy with that, too. The only thing I would add is that the recommendation around the Ethics Board having a finding and recommending a penalty.
We also talked about increasing the number of
Yes. I think-
members of the Ethics Board.
Right. To 5. Yeah.
I think I'm fine with seeing both of those things in language, and then we can get a real.
That was what I was
Yeah.
Yeah.
going to ask.
Yeah.
Is there a consensus around that?
I think it's sensible, because then we can get true public comment on what that looks like with those changes, and see where we are at that point.
Okay.
Right. Then the next item on our agenda is city committee structure. When we first started this committee, I sent out a copy of all the rules, the ordinances, all the committees at the city level. And one of the things that we've been tasked with addressing is committee structure, and for a few different reasons. One of them is that it can be a bit confusing right now, our current committee structure, because we have in our committee structure standing committees that are approved by ordinance. We have subcommittees, even if some of them are not called subcommittees of the council. We have blue ribbon committees. Then we also have, boards and commissions on top of that. And some of these committees kind of fall into kind of this in-between status. And I think it can be really confusing to residents. They're also not all listed with the city on the same page on our website, which I think is also a little bit confusing. So I think we need to embark upon an effort to look at committee structure and make some recommendations to the council around what makes the most sense as far as functioning of the city and functioning of the council with regard to committees. What committees, and then we also have to ask ourselves what committees need to exist at the council level. What committees are just committees for staff? I think we have some committees that are functioning, they're kind of in between serving staff requests, and serving council requests. So they don't really report back to the council, yet they're listed as appointed committees from the council. So I guess I have lots of questions around what would be the best practice on committees?
Might it be, well, I know we had a list early on, I think that you circulated of all the committees. And I was trying to see, I want
Yes.
to put my fingers on that.
It's
Was it-
with the February email.
Yes, February 14th, I circulated a list of all the committees with the February 14th. Let me see if I can pull it up. I don't know if I can join, maybe I can join. Would it help if I joined the Zoom and shared?
You can join it too.
Okay, so I will do that.
I'm almost wondering if we need a table, at least to start with. You know, some of the
Like
committees.
an
for-
org chart.
Yeah, because, for example, the Cable Communications Commission, that's a statutorily required one, so it's in our ordinance, but there's also a state statute that requires us to have one, and
Right.
I'm wondering if a little spreadsheet with kind of some of that history, we have our new cemetery committee, but then we also have our historical African Burying Ground Stewardship Committee that's responsible for the memorial and for looking specifically and discussing issues related to, the descendants. And so there's some state statutes that kind of govern that, which you wouldn't know except if you've served on the committee. And so I'm wondering if a spreadsheet with a bit of that breakdown. I also didn't know, maybe we need to look at naming conventions, because that may be part of the confusion too, and then taking a close look at our website. I know we're right now working to build out and update the cemetery committee, for example, website. There's a working group from that committee that's working with Stephanie Secord to kind of put some pieces in place to make it clearer and link to other parts of our website. And it's just taking attention. It's like, oh, here's a gap. So if a spreadsheet like that would be helpful with a little bit of is there a statute that's associated with this, or is there an ordinance, or both in some cases, like with the Cable Commission? Would that be helpful? And then,
I think that would be incredibly helpful. I just shared my screen so that the public can see what we're talking about. They're Blue Ribbon Advisory Committees, and so there's a whole series of Blue Ribbon Advisory Committees, summaries of what they do.
Yeah,
Some of them
and-
don't have,
And it's important to identify them as blue ribbon committees because they sunset at the end of
correct.
each council term, so.
yes.
Correct.
But some of them don't, which is intriguing. Some of them, while they sunset, we haven't been in practice of reappointing all of their members. So that's kind of the challenge. So a good example of that would be the Sustainable Practices Blue Ribbon Committee. Is a Blue Ribbon Committee, but we're not in the practice of reappointing them all. We appoint new people. So I guess we don't have standard practice is my concern around the way we address all of these committees and the way that they're supposed to function. We have some that are defunct, like the Von Mall Blue Ribbon Committee. The boards and commissions and standing committees. So these are all standing committees or boards or commissions. And generally, standing committees would be established by
ordinance.
Yeah, by ordinance, exactly. But we don't always have some of these representatives. So that's another concern as well. I think we heard at the last council meeting, like, for example, the demolition committee hasn't been meeting. I don't believe we have a coast representative right now.
Well, the demolition committee, I think, is ad hoc, right? It meets when
As
there's
needed. Yeah.
As needed.
Yep.
And so then we have questions around, okay, normalization of scheduling, and what does that look like, and making sure that the public is aware of when and how these committees would meet. And then we have a few new ones, clearly, like governance and the new land use committee, which I personally would classify as subcommittees. like the legislative subcommittee of the council. But I'm not sure that that's actually the appropriate structure, given that the land use committee also has non-council members represented on it. So you'll see there are lots of different committees and commissions, and I think it can be extremely confusing to our residents. And it would be very helpful if we streamlined some of these, especially those that are no longer meeting. And then I have another concern around not having committees that represent interests of large swaths of the city. For example, we have a recreation board, but we don't have a parks
Board.
committee or
Yeah.
a parks board.
And we have a cemeteries board and a African burial board.
Exactly. So it would be very helpful if we can delineate responsibilities, or we can say, you know, who has responsibility, for example, a park that we don't have a blue ribbon committee for. Does that, it just falls to city staff? Do we have any residents involved in those decisions around parks and maintenance and decisions for
Right.
what we do with parks?
For example, all of the decisions about Prescott Park are right now under the city manager and DPW. There's
Well,
n-
and the Prescott Park, the trustees of trust funds has historically weighed in on.
They've weighed in, but, you know, over time, the maintenance of the park moved from the trustees to the city,
That's true.
which is a good thing because the trust funds were not able financially to swing it. So we're getting better maintenance of the park, but there's no public component to it, or not as much of a public component as you'd think. So I agree with you, Councilor Cook. That's the long-term direction of our parks is something that we should take a look at. And the chances for new parks.
Yes.
There's some parts of the city that have those opportunities.
If we don't have anyone talking about parks and thinking and planning distinctly from the public perspective about where we need parks, we don't get that public input. And then it falls just to the city staff, and then they have to do special sessions to get public input, which I think it would be really helpful to have a responsive public body.
It sounds to me, if we're going to explore how to get input on parks, that I should touch base with both Peter Rice and with Beverly Mesa Zent, because certainly parks and open space is part of that master planning process. So I'm happy to reach out to both of them and kind of get some feedback, and if need be, you know, if it makes sense to bring them here to, you know, the next committee meeting, when we have a table in front of us, or when you're ready for that kind of input on how we get public input, or how we could work with the committee to get more public input on parks and care for our parks and new parks and
Yep.
that stuff. Okay.
So next steps here would be to put together a chart so that
Yes.
we all know, and bring this back at our next meeting.
Yep.
And start that discussion around where we have duplication of services, where we need services.
Yeah, and I think some of the sort criteria, so to speak, would be, is it a standing board or commission or committee by ordinance? Is it mayor's blue ribbon? Does it meet regularly scheduled? Does it meet ad hoc? Is it required by ordinance, by state statute?
Right. I think all those factors are really important, and it's also really important for us to consider our needs as a city. You know, do we have too many committees?
We have a
And
lot.
I think that's a question we have to ask, because every time we have a committee meet, we use staffing hours,
Yep.
which is an increased cost to residents. So we have to be talking about, you know, how do we streamline that as well, so that we have the most effective process in place without overutilizing city resources.
And I'll also follow up with the clerk's office on particularly the mayor's blue ribbon committees and how that process of reappointment would work in the ideal world, you know, in terms of maybe increasing transparency and communication. And I know she has a process, and she's been following a process, but clearly if it's not, you know, feeling transparent enough, then we need to look at that. And so I'll grab information from her and bring it back. So.
Thank you.
It's interesting looking at some other cities and their committees. We have more, but we have more because people are engaged. So, you know, that's a good thing.
I agree. I think it's a very good thing. I think I'm really mindful, though, of not being careful not to ask volunteers to spend a significant amount of time if it's not necessary, and to make sure that their expertise is utilized wisely.
Right.
And so that's a goal I think I have for this process too. I want to make sure that everyone who volunteers feels useful and they feel like they're contributing.
Right. You know, one of our goals from our retreat was to invite and welcome citizen engagement, but we want citizens to be able to feel satisfied that they've made meaningful accomplishments and contributions. So we need to put them to work where we can get good results.
Any other concerns there?
I can't add anything at this point.
Right, we will bring that back to the next meeting of governance. The next thing on our agenda is the charter amendment process and suggested changes by Councilor Denton. This is another issue that was referred to us by the City Council that came up in an early City Council meeting. And we received a charter amendment process memo from legal explaining the charter amendment process. The suggested changes by Councilor Denton involved recommending a change to voting by ward, and then for at-large seats. So that would put in place kind of a different method of electing city councilors. I think that this is something that is going to elicit a lot of comment from the public. I think not just at the governance committee level, but also at the council level, and it will require quite a bit of discussion. The charter amendment process is very long. I'm not saying that I think that this will move forward. I'm just saying that I think that the process itself is a long one, and any effort to amend the charter is going to take a long time. I would love to start that discussion around those suggested changes, and get kind of initial, I mean, I know that there are some initial concerns. I'd love to hear your initial concerns around these suggested changes, if you have them.
Well, anything that major, we'd want a ton of public input. And this may be something that might be smart to review with past mayors, maybe a group of past mayors, when we're talking about ward representation and a separate race for mayor. Those are very, very big changes. So I think, and I'm thinking and talking at the same time here, which is always dangerous, but, you know, some of our former mayors could give their input to this committee, but I think we need some other way to get public input. I know myself, what I'm hearing when I talk to people who've been on past councils or on current councils is if you have a separate mayor's race and 2 or 3 councilors want to run, only one person can be mayor, and so you lose a couple of experienced councilors. And then, you know, if you have ward representation, is that as competitive a race as at large? So,
Also, does ward representation kind of influence the sense of representing the whole city, as opposed to setting up competition for resources for ward? And,
right. You know, if you support this for my ward, I'll support that for your ward, kind
yeah,
of.
yeah. Sounds like Boston to me.
There is a fair amount of, you know, experience direct from the, you know, the other municipalities here in New Hampshire. And, you know, certainly at the legal department level, when we talk with our colleagues in other cities, you know, there are pros and cons, and I think you've identified some of the cons with changing the structure, which is, you know, if you have a specific mayor's, you know, race that you're running for, you may lose two really good candidates and who you would actually like to have on your city council. So that is definitely something that, you know, is certainly a consideration. And we've also had a number of conversations with other municipalities that, you know, do have the ward voting, and, you know, sometimes it is that sad factor, depending on where the ward line is drawn, that your better candidates are just on the wrong side of the road in terms of their experience and their interest and time to serve. So, you know, there are pros and cons, obviously, to each, but certainly in our kind of informal conversations with other council, our forum here in Portsmouth, you know, has been pretty successful in terms of the civility of the conversations by and large over the years. I mean, I've been here 18 years now. I think this was a long time. And just, yeah, the politics by and large aren't too bad. You know, there seems to be a fairly good common interest, and I think the important thing, which you guys are keeping in mind, is how to go out into those other neighborhoods that maybe don't show up to the city council meetings because they have work commitments or aren't as sophisticated with how to work with government and get their voices heard. You know, how to reach out to those communities differently so that they are heard and their needs, you know, are not overlooked. But if there's anything we can do, you know, to kind of grab some of that information or give some feedback on what other communities are doing. I don't think, given the other work, we could do that for the next meeting, but certainly we have those conversations amongst, you know, others who are in our positions about what seems to work well, and sometimes it depends on the size of the community, right? So a city of 100,000, it looks a little different than the size city we have. So,
Thank you.
And, you know, I'd like to hear from Councilor Denton, too, because it came up at our first council meeting, and he had it on the agenda under his name, but we never had a motion, so we never heard him speak to it and say, what needs to be fixed here? What's the
rationale?
What's the rationale?
Why don't we, not for the next meeting, but in 4 weeks, so the meeting after that, we schedule a more thorough discussion around this topic. We invite Councilor Denton to come and speak to that. And then we also invite some former mayors at the same time to come and speak with the governance committee.
Yep.
And have maybe a kind of an initial discussion around what views are and what experiences are. And then we'll keep exploring this. I don't think that is by no means going to be the last meeting that we discuss this. That's kind of the introductory meeting to move forward with this discussion. But it is something that we do need to tackle because clearly it was recommended by a city councilor. The request went in. So does that seem like a reasonable timeline to start in 4 weeks?
Yeah, and I think we also need to know from our legal department, is this a revision of the charter, or would this require us to,
Amend it?
yeah, can we amend the charter, or do we have to go through the process of
Revision.
a whole charter revision?
Yeah. And there are other things in the charter that need to be looked at.
Right, because
We're
once you
doing
open that door, that's a big topic.
Well, the good thing is in parallel, there are some committees listed that we're supposed to have in the charter that are defunct as well. So it would give us an opportunity to also eliminate some defunct committees. I think that haven't been around for 20 years or so that are
Are there
listed.
things in the charter that the staff thinks need updating?
I would say that's probably a yes.
Yeah. So, this is a much bigger project than just one piece of it. Then, wow.
My suggestion would be if we know that 4 weeks from now, when you have that meeting, assuming that doesn't fall like on Bob's baseball trip or something, maybe we make sure Bob is here for that. So if there's any, I'm sure what that date is. But.
If there's an issue, we'll discuss at the next meeting, changing that if we need to.
Yeah.
This is going to be a long process no matter what.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, this is.
And ultimately, we can talk about general things. We could also do a request, general things from staff around concerns in the charter in that meeting and just tackle those two things, and that's it. And those will be more informational, kind of first introduction to any other changes that are requested in the charter.
Well, that's good, because it looks like on the 25th, I am not here, so we'll put Bob in the hot spot.
Okay. All right, so that's what we'll plan for the April 25th meeting instead. Thank you for sharing initial views. I think it's helpful for us to start this discussion, knowing that it's a long time frame on that. The next thing on the agenda that also is something that the committee needs to attack is land use board appointment normalization. And this came up because it seems like our appointment process for our land use board somehow got off schedule. So we don't have the rotation that you would envision normally, and that the state envisioned when writing the statute. This requires some discussion with legal, but it also might require a little discussion with the state as far as land use boards, because we appoint people for 3-year terms. But I think the vision there was always that the terms were 3 years, not necessarily the person was 3 years, and somewhere along the lines, we appointed somebody to replace somebody in a few different boards, and that instead of fulfilling the term, they served 3 years, and that offset our stagger, which I think that everyone benefits when there's a healthy stagger. It means that every mayor gets the opportunity to appoint the same number of people generally to those land use boards in their 2-year term. And then we also have to ask the question around when those appointments occur.
Right.
And what is the appropriate timing, because they are slightly staggered, but only our 2 major land use boards are only staggered 30 days off of each other. And they also both fall within a time frame that is falls after an election. So that there's question around that. I think that it's key from a governance perspective, this is my viewpoint, that we find a way to build trust in the populace, and the way you do that is by making sure everyone feels that the process is fair. And so we want to make sure that it's a fair process, and that no one has any perceptions that it isn't. So, Suzanne?
Yeah, and I know Bob Sullivan and I discussed how that stagger might be corrected, and I am looking for the notes in this file, and I'm not finding them. But I know we sort of came up with an idea of how we might be able to get back onto the stagger that both the ordinance and the state statutes anticipated would happen. So I'll have to dig that up for the next meeting, because I know we talked about it, but my apologies.
So in other words, there's a set number of positions that can be turned over in a year.
You know, it's the way most committees are set up or launched, you know, both.
It'd also be helpful to know, because I don't think the end date of board members' terms are all the same. I think they're different for some of the different boards.
Yes.
Some fall in, you know,
Some are in June, some are in December. I know those, at least those two.
so,
And
You know,
keep in
it-
mind, some of the, with the land use boards, some of that may have depended on when the authorizing state statute came into effect that granted the municipality then the opportunity to set up that board and to implement it. So that's part of the history, I'm sure.
I just want to double check that there is some form of relief when it comes to resetting a stagger. That may be it may have to occur over a certain number of years. And Portsmouth is in a unique position of having more people serving on land use boards than is mandated by the RSA, which is also a benefit. So we might be in a good position to do that, to reset a stagger without having to interrupt any terms. But it's a question we have to kind of look at and make sure that then we're setting ourselves up not to get off stagger again, because I think that can create conflict in your community. And the last thing you want is conflict in government. You want people to have faith.
well, it should be stable and predictable. You know, and the same or a consistent methodology for each of the boards.
Yes.
And right now, we've got differing end dates, differing amounts of stagger. So it's hard. My impression is, this is my impression, you have to go to each board and look at the enabling.
chart.
Yeah. You have to look at the ordinance.
Other people here in my office are good at Excel. I'm not. I fake it.
I know when I warned the city manager after we established this committee that we might be occupying a lot of legal's time. I will apologize now in advance for that. But we probably need to go through these one by one. And as far as scheduling goes, from what I can tell, next week we're discussing the ethics process and committee structure. And then 2 weeks after that, we will discuss the charter amendment process and potential recommendation from Councilor Dutton. As far as land use board appointment normalization, we probably should schedule that after. We have handled one of these, like we've settled one of these issues so that we're not.
We're not going to settle the
I know.
charter issue, so.
No, we're not going to settle the charter issue, but potentially we could get through our work on the ethics process in the next month and a half, and then be in a situation where we could take this up is kind of the next big task for the committee. Does that seem reasonable? I don't want the committee to be overwhelmed. There are only 3 of us with all of this work.
Well, I think we've delegated it out pretty well.
So should we ask legal then to start preparing kind of a primer on the different land use boards and the rotations that we could
kind of-
use potentially in 6
May?
weeks, yes.
Yeah.
Next week?
6 weeks.
6 weeks.
In 6 weeks.
I thought you said next week.
In about 6 weeks' time.
And do we want to keep going it every other week in May when we get to budget crunching?
That's exactly what I was going to say, is that you've got budget coming in May, and I'm sure that's going to take some time.
Yeah, I think that that's a real question mark around this. I think that if we can get through the ethics process and address committee structure, I think a lot of these things that around charter and land use, in my view, will get pushed kind of to June. Seems like about the time frame that we'll be discussing these. Because it would be nice to finish up
Yeah,
some
we
of
could-
these other tasks.
We
I
could
just-
do an interim report back to the council maybe
Yeah.
on those first ones.
That makes sense. So I just want to make sure that we're all aware, these are all the things that we've been tasked with. That's why they're on the agenda today. The next is city council contact communication processes. Whether or not we have best practice there for, we have email communication now, and we have just added a public dialogue recommendation to the council. But then the question becomes, do we need disclaimers on email? Do we need anything around that? And this is, I think, generally a question that we can just refer to legal. You know, if we need a disclaimer that says this is the opinion of one city councilor, and if we need to make sure that all of our committees have information on policy around email and use of email and public record, right to know, and also about reply all and creating a quorum and right to know.
You know, I'm just thinking, some of the folks in the HR department are much cleverer than I am in terms of eye-catching reading material. So they do kind of brochure pieces with pictures or graphics. Maybe we do a committee member 101 type brochure with what to do, what not to do, that is easy to read, got a little color in it, you know, just as something to
Yeah.
distribute or hand out. I know we did one quite a while ago for city staff on, I think, use of email, just a reminder of do's and don'ts or something like that. And I thought, oh, well, it caught your eye. You kind of looked at the graphics, then you read the text. I'm like, oh, yeah, that did work a little better than your standard boring memo. So as long as we don't have a short time frame on that, I'd be glad to work with HR and see if we could develop a very simple, colorful, you know, eye-catching, you might not just file it away, but might actually read it, kind of brochure that would just be distributed every year to committee members, new and old, because it does change. Sometimes the state law changes, and we could kind of flag something. Anyways, that's a thought, because I remember
Yeah.
thinking it was eye-catching and it wasn't too much information for staff to say, oh, I see what I, you know,
I think that would be useful.
don't use city email to sign up for a Netflix account, you know, like simple things, but sometimes people don't
Yeah, I think.
always understand.
Isn't there an internet and email use policy right now? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, but there's a long policy, and then there's the quick
Right.
reminder, takeaway, yeah.
I have particular concerns around whether or not all of our volunteers who sit on committees are aware. You know, the city council receives a general orientation, but people who serve on committees do not always receive an orientation. And whether or not they're familiar with some of these basic policies around communication and right to know, but then more generally, are they familiar with their responsibilities? It isn't as critical at the committee level, but once you move to a commission or board level, and you have a quasi-judicial
Yes.
concerns, it might be helpful to start this process as part of a bigger HR
That's training.
push training for training, yes. And it even could be an online training where people watch YouTube videos about their responsibilities, but something that is
Yeah.
like a mandatory training.
I will say, the new planning director has been working with the land use boards to do training specific to their obligations and responsibilities because, obviously, as you just pointed out, they sit frequently in that quasi judicial capacity, which is the really tricky one. And so I know they've been doing some training, and she's looking to kind of more formalize the process. So I would say set aside the land use boards, because I think she's working very diligently to kind of put pieces in place very specific to their responsibilities and
And I know that.
Obligations.
That City Attorney Bob came to the HDC, came to the planning board and stuff, and reviewed these things with us when I was on the HDC. And I think he did that yearly.
it hasn't been yearly, but that's part of what the
Close to
planning
that,
director
yeah.
is looking at, how to, more regularize, I guess, that process.
Does New Hampshire Municipal Association have any?
Yes, and that she is, I think, has already tagged some of those resources for her
Okay.
boards. And I can, if she's done, she may be able to do a short memo or something for this committee in terms of what she's done there, if that would be helpful.
I think that would be
That would be helpful.
yeah, incredibly helpful. And maybe that's something that we can start looking at and give her time, clearly. I know that she has a lot on her plate right now as well with some employment agreements coming up. So in 6 weeks as well, maybe we can revisit this if we get a memo back, knowing that we're looking at the long-term best practice for training of volunteers.
Yeah. No, I think that's rightly falls under governance.
Okay. The last thing really on our agenda is, and this one just came up, increasing resident engagement on the CIP and the budget. This is, I don't know, I'd love to hear viewpoints on how we do this. We have a budgetary process coming up soon. Any ideas?
Well, I can go back to way back. When was the big recession? 2007, 8, 2009. We, through Portsmouth Listens, invited everybody to work in small groups to go through a budget exercise. And the exercise was, if you have to achieve a 2 or 3% only increase in the budget, how would you do it?
Oh.
And it was very informative. People learned a lot. People learned how to calculate what every $100,000 of expense is in their tax rate. They saw it pretty quickly and clearly. And in the end, they chose to fully fund education and look at tighter budgets for public safety. This was 2000. This was the recession times.
Mm-hmm.
It was not contentious. It was actually, people worked through it. I'm just pulling that idea out. I don't know that we could launch something like that in time for this budget cycle, but citizens working in small groups over 4 nights can learn a tremendous amount and give a lot of feedback.
Yeah, it would be hard to pull that out now.
Yeah. Because it takes a lot of preparation. I mean, you need to sort of, and you need to have presentations by people from the city, so. But it was, the former city manager was really uptight about it. And then at the end said, you know, that worked out pretty well. We had to prove its worth to him.
Is there do you think there's a shorter version of that that might incorporate some of those ideas, but be achievable for this budget session?
There's a group called, I've forgotten now. There are various deliberative democracy groups who have models for it. I could look into that.
I wonder what the cost is associated with a program like that.
It's not much.
Not much with Portsmouth Listens.
No, it's energy, not money.
Yeah.
I was going to say that I would agree with Counselor Tabor, which is it's a question of can staff be geared up enough to plug pieces in
Right.
to that kind of exercise. I'm intrigued. I don't remember doing that exercise, so I probably wasn't dragged into it. But I do think that I like the idea of smaller groups because that's where you get
It's
that
dialogue,
different
yeah.
level of communication and a real.
Maybe we can fulfill our public dialogue sessions in 1 month.
You know, that because the counselors will be diving into the budget details, maybe a public dialogue, couple of public dialogue sessions where you have that ability to engage with citizens kind of one-on-one and explain, okay, here's the trade-off of, schools versus, snow plowing kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe that becomes the short-term way to increase that communication. Well, I'm
Right.
very much intrigued about whatever was done
I'll
that
pull out.
I missed
I'll
out.
send you I'll send us all some of the material from.
I think that a lot of the council is also going to be learning the budget process. And so it's another reason perhaps to do it with the aid of staff too. It would be informative. It would be informative to me, certainly. John, you've gone through it before, so.
Yeah. Well, it takes a lot of focus
Yeah.
from the council. It takes a lot of focus, and we get the privilege of really reviewing each of the budgets with the department heads and asking the questions, and we need to prepare for that carefully. It's a challenge.
Yeah.
I see that process as being slightly daunting too for residents when the councilors when we're working in working sessions. I feel like some of our public is comfortable with that. Some of the public is not comfortable making comments about something they're seeing in a working session. In this sense, public dialogue would be really helpful. I'm happy to go back if you guys want and check with the city manager on staff bandwidth around that, because clearly we would probably want financial staff, and during the budget season, that's asking a lot more for a staff that is, I think, understaffed already. But do you want me to go back and ask the city manager if we could maybe schedule some public dialogue and have staff availability for that, if there is staff availability, in addition to our budget sessions?
Yeah, and
It's a conversation.
And I think you have to approach it at a high level. When we do the budget, we approach it at a line-by-line level. Each night, our work session goes into each department. But I think rather than get into line-by-line detail, we want to know from the citizen engagement is there a consensus around priorities? Because a budget's priorities, right? It's what you fund and what you don't fund.
Mm-hmm.
And where you fund expansion and where you fund holding the line. So if we could, again, I'm thinking and talking at the same time, and that's always dangerous, but just a pie chart of here's schools, here's police, here's fire, and priorities around those. What are their major programs at work? And demand for their services. If it was at a high level, I think you could have a fair amount of dialogue in one night.
It's reasonable.
And I think that relieves a lot of the administrative burden, because that's, there always are engaged citizens who'll come in and read the budget online, and they'll say, I think you're spending too much on office furniture in the Public Works Department. But I think what's valuable for the council is where do we think we want to spend more on services? Where do we think we want to hold the line on services? Where do you think? And what's more important to you? Level of service or your tax bill? Everybody says they want lower taxes, but nobody wants less services. So I think a benefit of a dialogue is people actually have to confront those choices.
It's reasonable.
I just imagined a scenario which would be pretty staff intensive, but that one night have 3 different out in the community meetings. But then you'd kind of get it done in one night. And you'd have representative staff and council there.
I think it's definitely worth a conversation and see if that's another way to, make that public input piece
More engaging.
Yeah, more open and available to those who are not comfortable coming to the city council meeting and, just making a public comment, who actually want to have that dialogue and maybe a little Q&A, and because it's a, municipal budgeting is a, little different animal than your household budgeting, and there are similarities and there are differences, and John's right, it's about the goal setting too, where are your priorities,
So I will have a conversation with the city manager about scheduling time for that with staff availability, check in on availability. And I'll report back at our next meeting, at the end of our next meeting, and we can determine if we want to make a recommendation to the council to move forward with a session on the budget.
Yep, that sounds good.
The final item was committee priorities for the next meeting. I think that we've
think we've
identified
done
those.
that.
Yes. So I want to move to public comment. We have about 17 minutes left in the room. I want to make sure that we can hear from everyone. So
Great.
is there public comment? Please come up.
Where would you like us to sit?
Wherever you like. We're very flexible.
What are the guidelines? Is there a time limit?
We try to limit to 3 minutes for public comment if
But
possible.
that's not a hard limit. Thank you. So I'll try to just speak on things that I have firsthand knowledge on. My name's Greg Mahana, Portsmouth City resident, planning board member. First of all, I'll go backwards from most recent to before so I can share time with my associates out here. Governance committee is pretty important. I mean, you have a big reach over a lot of important things like the charter. 10 a.m. on a Monday doesn't promote public involvement. Anybody that works for a living hates Mondays. And 10 o'clock on a Monday, you couldn't have picked a worse time. So I'll give you that note. Next up, city council communications, email policy, things like that. And you spoke about HR and committees and boards. The new planning director, she's doing an excellent job. Love her. Good communication. She's in the deep end of the pool. Staff isn't supporting her. As a new planning board member, we got nothing. Nothing. We had to ask for it. Okay? Nothing. Not even an email list of who is on the boards and who our contacts are in the planning department. We had to drag it out. Last planning board meeting, we never got an email with the planning board package, ever. It was supposed to be out the Friday before the Thursday planning board. Now, some of us use the city iPads, but we've learned that that whole communication process is horrid because the Friday before you'll get the package, and then between that Friday and Thursday, all kinds of stuff comes out, public comment, yada, 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 and it doesn't get added to the package. It's only sent in email. So the only way you could possibly be prepared at the meeting is to have a laptop here with city communications on it and the iPad over here, because we're not allowed to use email on the iPad, so we can't get all the public comment documents. So as you probably know, the planning board package is over 400 pages on a regular basis. And there's no organization to it. There's no hyperlinks. There's no nothing. And it totally hamstrings, in your own words, one of the more important land use boards in the city. So we started off at a disadvantage. Now, I would tell you that also, we did get all the links to the state videos, and some of us watched them all, and they're very informative. But it doesn't, and that's great from a high-level perspective, but it doesn't give you any nuances to what's going on in Portsmouth. And we've yet to have any training. And as a perfectly good example, 6 o'clock Wednesday night, we have a meeting of the planning board, which is public, oddly enough, but it involves what we do and what our responsibilities are. I only learned about that this weekend from the chair, and he said, well, they were supposed to send that out last week. Well, good idea. And then when we finally got the agenda the second time today, they took the most important thing off of it, work sessions for planning board members. As you guys know, as council members, you can't go in cold, pick up an issue, and debate it in an efficient and timely manner. You gotta know about it in advance. So you can either form your opinion, do your research, or do your due diligence. So you can't walk into a meeting cold to fire off a big issue like one of the biggest buildings in downtown Portsmouth, as an example for a planning board member. Moving right along. Governance committee, planning board. There's an extra planning board member on there. It's been, Dexter Legg ignored it. Rick Chalman pushed it multiple times. It has been put in writing on appeals for 2 recent projects that the planning board had issues with and appeals. In writing, it's been mentioned by developers. So it can't be ignored any longer. You know, it was a Bohenko thing and it was a Dexter Legg thing. And look at the planning board charts. We have 1 extra member that shouldn't be there. Nobody wants to address it. Last and not least, this one's kind of simple. I'm on a lot of boards. You're talking about amending the charter. It's pretty simple, guys. On any corporate board, condo association, whatever, there's always a bylaw committee. Because you can't change a bylaw without a majority vote of whatever those shareholders are, or residents, or whatever that is. So the bylaw committee is tasked with catching those proposed changes and vetting them and teeing them up based on priority in a way that they get passed. Because if you've ever been on any homeowners association board or corporate board, walking up in front of the room and proposing a bylaw change, you might as well, paint a target on your chest. There has to be a committee to put that change together and tee it up in a manner that it's going to be useful for everybody's time. Thanks, guys. I know there's other folks that want to talk.
Oh, thank you so much.
Could I just ask Suzanne a question?
Yes.
Do planning board members have a email capture the same as city councilors?
No. And keep in mind that because they sit in a quasi judicial capacity, you don't want the public to be
Right.
weighing in outside of the public hearing. You want, that process has got to be within that public hearing process when they're taking input from others. Now, I do know the planning director has been very concerned about the late notices and lack of notices. She is very well aware of the fact that the first 2 months were pretty bumpy. And so she has been working with other staff to try and fix that, to put in a better process. So I think it'll be good. I'll have her include that in kind of her report back, because that's something that has been high on her priority list, to fix the process issues that she had to deal with when she arrived here.
Again, I wasn't critical of her. I support her completely. She's not getting the support from staff.
And we're working on that one, so.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Petra Huda, 280 South Street. I'm going to kind of make comments as I wrote them down here and went through the list. My first question is, why weren't the minutes included in the package just like the agenda? In most meetings, if you're going to approve minutes, they should be included in the package for the public to view. That was my first thing. My next question is, due to the fact that you didn't have a quorum last time, how does it work that the rules that you actually agreed on, you weren't supposed to make any decisions, were put in the packet to be okayed? That's just a question. Then I'd like to go back to the discussion on the rules. And I guess just put some comments and some points for you to consider forward. On Rule 43, something you might consider, what I'm asking about is the section you put in there that the counselors will report back at the next council meeting. This is kind of contrary to a subject that is fresh and in everybody's minds at that time. And it also could have, in that period of time between one meeting and the next, the decisions could have been made and the subject could have moved on. So just like is or was done now before the pandemic, I would ask you to consider that previously a counselor that was involved in the discussions would do a summary to the council and the public, and then if the public had a dispute with that, it would be able to be discussed in the public comment. That's my first one. My next one, on the discussion about ethics. I totally support having an ethics officer. The thing I would ask you to consider seriously here, since you will be considering spending taxpayer money, is that if this person is going to be independent and be your expert on ethics and law, that person, when an ethics complaint comes in, would be the first contact. The problem here, and we've seen it in the last two ethics complaints that came in, was that prior to even making a judgment or an announcement, we had one of the people, the mayor, make a public statement where his position was. So we all knew what was going to happen prior because the statement was made in public and put in the newspaper. So that would be a consideration to have this actually be an independent, qualified party, like was discussed. The other problem I have here, and I would like you to consider this, is the fact that you're considering having the Ethics Committee make a recommendation for a penalty. I guess I'm having a problem here from my experience on the Audit Committee, because the Audit Committee, by ordinance, was supposed to make a recommendation by vote of an auditor, and this did not happen. We, the public, still have no idea who was voted on and who was accepted or moved forward. The presentation that Councilor Tabor did not satisfy me as to what actually happened per the vote of the Audit Committee. And did the council vote on the recommendation of the Audit Committee for an auditor? That's an open question. The next thing is all of this was not moved forward to the public for any idea. The governing body is still the council, no matter the recommendation of the Audit Committee or an Ethics Committee, and the decision is theirs and theirs alone. The next thing I would like to speak about is, let's see, I guess I could just hit increasing resident engagement in the CIP and the budget. The discussion that Councilor Tabor had put forward is basically called the Finance Committee. And I could tell you from my experience as a resident now, that putting forward something on the CIP, my experience has been, my questions were not acknowledged, my questions were not answered, and they're still hanging out there. And basically, it depends on what the city council wants to hear and wants to move forward. People don't want to come forward and just talk blindly to the council and have everything ignored. My experience. So I don't know if that helps you, but that would be the problem there. So I guess the last thing I kind of like to discuss is, and go back to the ethics thing and the ethics complaint that is standing currently against Councilor Tabor. The Audit Committee, when it was formed and written down, had put safeguards in there. And the safeguards were that the presentations would be done by experienced financial professionals. And what we saw basically was a counselor coming forward and giving non-public confidential information out that was discussed in an audit committee meeting, and then possibly in another meeting, and disclosing how many proposers there were and the name of the proposer who was not selected. Now that is critical, because the problem is, until a contract is signed, and Deputy City Manager, whatever hat you have on today, knows this. The process of negotiation doesn't and is not guaranteed to put in the first selected auditor, vendor, whatever you want to call it. And what happened was you notified the non-selected persons or vendors in public. So that's, according to RSA 42(1)A, that's a breach. And I don't know, have any idea how it's going to be dealt with. This precludes the charter. This goes to the state statutes. So I just want to clarify that and make sure that in doing good governance, this is considered in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there any more public comment? We have about 3 more minutes. I know somebody is using the room at noon, so.
Mark Brighton, South Mill Street. I have a question. The question won't lead to an ethics complaint, but Mr. Mahana also has mentioned that the meeting time here is untenable. And since Madam Chair has made herself the ethics expert on the council, is it ethical to have meetings at this time when the governed can't really attend? I mean, you have how many people here today? This is absurd. You need to hold these at a reasonable hour. This is a damned important committee, and yet you're treating it like it isn't because you're not giving the people a chance to weigh in. Is this ethical?
Is there any other public comment?
My name is Liza Hewitt. I live at 726 Middle Road. Mine may be viewed as not that important, but it's something that's been bothering me. And I think if you're talking about communication with the residents, it would be very helpful if you could fill out your calendar on your city website so that I, as a resident, who has somewhat busy schedule and does not have the time to know about meetings that City Hall knows about well in advance and is not put on the calendar. For instance, the Parking, Traffic, and Safety Committee. That is not on the calendar for the 7th of April. I make an assumption that that's when it is because usually they are the first Thursday of the month. The time has changed. The Land Use Committee meetings that I know have been scheduled are not on the calendar. And so I think if you want residents involved, I understand you do not have to, or at least my understanding from others is that you do not have to put those on until 24 hours in advance. But my goodness, if you want us to come out and speak and you care about what I, as a resident, have to say, I really think that you could put that on the calendar, especially since I know you know when those meetings are right now. So that's what I would ask. The CIP, I think maybe some recommendations have been made by residents as to how you could clean up the CIPs to make them more understandable for city residents. They're not, there's no chain of what's been proposed in the past, what's currently on the CIP, why it is that things have dropped off the CIP. And again, you know, that needs to come from you folks. If you want us involved, you need to help us. You need to make it easier for us to be involved. And if we don't understand what you're talking about from one year to the next with the CIP, it's very hard to be involved. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have one Zoom person who might want to speak.
Is there any more comment from the room? Okay. On Zoom?
Hi, this is Arthur Clough, 431 Pleasant Street. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have concerns about the timing of the governance meeting as well, but also I have concerns that this council has broken so many rules already. On the 22nd of February, you clearly had a non-meeting where you couldn't get to an agreement on an amendment to the dining ordinance, so the city manager and the mayor both said, hey, let's go take a break and we'll come back with a motion, and that's exactly what happened. No minutes for that meeting. And also, I believe it was on 3/5, there was a non-public and it had really no description, but we saw the audit committee there. I'm not gonna say too much more because I know that we're over time, but if you're gonna be doing the governance changes, you gotta be able to handle what's on your plate already. not having non-meetings, not violating right-to-know laws, not leaving people in the dark. I am surprised that there were no attachments. You had a document there. There was nothing about it attached to the meeting when I went online. That's not transparent. And then the last thing is, this is not either on YouTube or on the public channel right now. So I sure hope that you're recording the Zoom meeting, because I'm not sure why the previous meeting was recorded live and shown and this one isn't. Thanks.
Thank you. With that, I'm going to close public comment. Is there any other business? I entertain a motion to adjourn.
So again.
Second?
Moved, yeah.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay.